So I'm trying to discuss today what making RPGs that stand the test of time. I'm going to press this. Maybe we'll get lucky. This video might play. If it doesn't run in like 30 seconds, I'll just assume we're not going to get it. Bear with me. I'll know what I have here. Yeah. Okay. So that's not going to work. So my topics of discussion today, I think first starts with, again, not knowing how much people really know about me, is talk a little bit about my history, and then some of the influences that helped drive me to make the kind of games that I've been involved with. And then to discuss, what is a role-playing game? And certainly there's a lot of different thoughts on that. A little more specifics on my product history, what my philosophical approach to production is, talk about game balancing, and something I call personality and storytelling techniques. So first we'll start with me at a young age. My mom wanted me to put this slide in. I guess when I was young there weren't that many electronic games, so this is probably more relevant to my age. Everybody else now has iPhones or DSs or whatever they may have. But I've been in this business for a long time. Started at a very young age. I was always fascinated by electronics and games. And really the first two things that I had access to was the Magnavox Odyssey machine. This is really going back a long ways, and I don't expect most people would know this machine. But it was basically all you could do was play Pong. You could just knock a ball left and right. But what I thought was kind of funny was that if you wanted to do, say, like a haunted house game, it'd give you these mylar sheets that you would stick, and the static electricity would hold them up to your television set. And then the ball would then be like a ghost, and you'd move from room to room, and that was the extent of the graphics. All we could do was move one white blocked square around, and that's all there was to work with. But I really wasn't making games until at that point. It wasn't until the Apple II came out. My parents got me the Apple II, and that's where it really kind of dawned on me on how these things got put together. There's sort of a disconnect if you're just playing a Magnavox or maybe an Atari or a game machine. You're not clear as to how they come together. And so the Apple II allowed me to jump in and start getting a sense of how to put these things together. I taught myself how to program. I remember getting my first 16K RAM expansion card, thinking, what am I going to do with all this memory? And I really consider myself to be sort of in the first wave of software entertainment entrepreneurs. Or sort of the first wave of software guys certainly were Bill Gates and that sort of like, but in terms of the first software entertainment guys, I was sort of in that first rush, and I'm probably one of the few that's left. I think Trip Hawkins certainly was in that first rush. I was right there. So a lot of people have moved on. I don't know if I'm just crazy or what, but here I am still standing. I was an avid book reader. I read thousands of books when I was a kid, and then I could discuss books and the importance of those. But certainly the Fellowship of the Ring, the Lord of the Rings books, big influence on me. In fact, I found one of my original Lord of the Rings books. I was in junior high school, and I had a computer program I had written on the inside front cover, and I found it. It had to be one of the first computer programs I ever wrote, and there was even a bug in it. So I looked at it right away. I thought, what was I thinking? The Piers Anthony books were great for comedy and fantasy. I hadn't seen a lot of that at the time. Heavy metal magazines. I used to collect all the issues of heavy metal magazines just to see all the different art styles, and also to see a fantasy that was aimed more towards adults than children. I think that was kind of the biggest wake-up call for me on heavy metal. There were some great books. This one particular one, Carrying Comfort by Dan Simmons. I mention that only because his books, where you could be following your favorite character, a protagonist, for 250 pages in, and then he could be killed off right in the middle of the book. And it was something where you just didn't know what was going to happen next. And that was a real sort of change for what I had read before. And the other was the Michael Moorcock series on Elric. He was kind of for the first anti-hero. He was a guy that basically, he was a hero, but he had a sword and would suck people's souls in, and he kind of felt guilty about it, but yet he continued on. And so to me, he was the first anti-hero. It was very interesting, sort of different kind of fiction for me. So these, some of the early influential books. Movies were a big part of who I was. Star Wars, certainly, I think a lot of people feel that way about Star Wars. I was first in line when Star Wars came out in my area. Planet of the Apes, huge movie for me. I used to go to the on Saturday and I'd watch the entire set of movies, all 5 of them back to back, sit there for 10 hours. The Omega Man was kind of the first zombie picture to me, in a way. In fact, my parents used to drop me off on weekends, and I'd see a double feature every Saturday, and I'd sit in the 3rd row. When this movie came out, one of those guys jumped out of the dark, scared me so bad I sat in the back row. I never sat in the 3rd row again as a kid. And then the Road Warrior, I certainly had a lot of, that was my post-apocalyptic influences, which ended up going on to Wasteland, ended up going on to Fallout later on. The Road Warrior was one of my absolute favorites movie series, my favorite movie for a long, long time. I've been chasing them to do a game based on the Road Warrior for 15, 20 years, and nothing ever happens. I think it'd be a great world to look at. And then Wizards, which was another very little-known animation game. Again, it was an animated movie with sort of an adult spin to it, when again, most of the animation at that time was more kid-oriented. And then, of course, lastly, Dungeons & Dragons used to play with my friends all the time, every day. In fact, the books you see in the upper left, those are the original Dungeons & Dragons books. They came out in 1978. They look much different now. I still have those original books. Our focus was less on the dice rolling, but more about putting people into situations and seeing how they behave as human beings. That was of a greater interest to us on the dungeon side, rather than just ramping monsters up, but putting them in situations that make the players fight with each other or get greedy and see how they do it. Oh, excuse me. I would say one thing about Dungeons & Dragons, and again, this has helped me as I've expanded and started doing the computer role-playing games, is that it's also important to expose yourself to life. I think a lot of people, they become so gamer-oriented that they don't expose themselves to anything outside that realm. And I think the more you round yourself off, I have a friend of mine who's a writer, and he sits in Starbucks, every day, all day, every day for 20 years, and he's not experiencing life as far as I'm concerned. So to me, all these things were my influence, but I also took a chance to experience life so you could write dialogue that was more meaningful, so you could understand how human beings thought. So my first company really was Interplay. I founded that in 1983 during the infancy of the industry. This was when a frontline retail game would cost $20,000 to $30,000 to make. If you compare that today, people in the U.S. are spending $50 million just to make a game. I think they spend more on their airfare for the press tour than we did on the entire budget for our games. So, I started off with floppy disks. We went to cartridges. We went to CDs. We went to DVDs. And often, I'm being presented these new platforms now, whether it's the Android or the iPad. And I always laugh when people think, are you sure you can make the transition to this next platform? And for us, it's probably, or for me, platform number 57. They just keep coming. I started with just a handful of people, kind of the group you see in that lower left there. Grew it up, that's probably where we were in the middle, and we grew up to 500 people at our peak. And I'm very proud of the franchises that we created during that time, from Battle Chest to Bard's Tale to Descent to Kingpin, Redneck Rampage, with a whole host of franchises that we did. And I started off as a developer for other people. We became a publisher. Then I became a developer again with my new company, and now here we are becoming a digital publisher. So it's very circular in that way. The other thing I'm very happy about, very pleased, is that recognizing young talent and giving them their first contract to get into business. Treyarch, who was one of those first companies, this company's since gone on to do Call of Duty. They did a small title for us called Die by the Sword. And it wasn't a big success, but we liked them. We liked the talent that we saw. You might have heard of this company, Blizzard. I've known these guys since they were young, when they were in high school. I gave them their first contract. In fact, when I was getting ready for this speech here, I was digging through my garage for things to remind me of what had been done, and I found an original piece of code that was created by one of the founders of Blizzard when he was a high school kid for me. I called him up at night. He couldn't believe I found this old piece of code. It was very funny. So Blizzard, and then BioWare also. Obviously a big house in RPGs. We gave them their first contract They did a mech warrior type product called Shattered Steel, and it wasn't a big success, but we thought they had talent, and we gave them another shot, and that's when they did Baldur's Gate for us. And so I'm very proud of some of the early companies we helped launch. So my new company, Exile, we started in 2002 as a developer and a publisher. Cost of being a retail publisher is quite prohibitive in the US these days for any smallerish company. So the first role-playing game we did was we did a remake of Bard's Tale. It's kind of a quirky game. It was sort of our version of kind of making fun of role-playing games. We wanted to do kind of a comedy. It was a very offbeat sort of title. And then we recently released Hunted, the Demon's Forge, which is an action role-playing game. And our next game, which is, although not a role-playing game, is Choplifter, which we're bringing out next month. So that's sort of some of the products we're doing ourselves. And I've seen there's more opportunity than ever before since I've been in this business. But I've seen more change in the last 3 years than I have in the last 27 combined. It's almost, being a business outside of more than 5 years, it almost isn't even relevant anymore. It's really the last 2 or 3, and that you really understand what's going on, and there's a lot to keep track of. The interplay was a warm-up exercise as far as I'm concerned. So then, what is a role-playing game, right? Well, there's a lot of different categories. You have tactical role-playing games, real-time role-playing games, MMO role-playing games, console role-playing games. Everybody has a different take on what those are. And certainly, and the Eastern versus the Western role-playing game is quite different. We could probably do a whole seminar just on that, right? Where the Eastern are maybe brighter graphics, more linear, younger heroes. The Western ones being older, darker, more of an open world, character creation focused. And there are pluses to minuses to both of those things. So all I can really discuss are my kind of role-playing games, which are the ones that I've made. So I'm not going to attempt to define every kind of role-playing game and get into the nuances of what makes them better, worse, or different. But I want to talk about my methodology for how I made some of the games that I've been involved with. So character identification and creation, that's certainly a hallmark of a role-playing game. I mean, one of the first things you're going to have to do is create and name your character through the use of points towards attributes and skills. This is nothing groundbreaking. Or you're going to start with a character whose gender is already look is already established. And those are very different kinds of ways to put the game together. In fact, the original Bard's Tale was you created your own party, and when it's a character creation game, we don't have any sense of who you are. We don't know your gender. I mean, we know, but from a pre-writing perspective, we don't know what you're going to be, right? We don't know whether you're human, you're a dwarf, you're a male, you're a female, you're a sorcerer, you're a wizard. And that creates a different sort of writing issue, right? In the later Bard's Tale, we knew it was a male, we knew he was cynical, we knew he was selfish, right? So we defined his character attributes, and so we could actually, to do it that way, provides a better writing environment, in my opinion. However, on the opposite side, especially the more hardcore role-playing games, they want to define everything. They want to create their character, they want to pick the color of their hair, they want to know what color their toenails are, they want to completely customize the avatar, and that is a different writing exercise than you do when you know what you're dealing with. And it seems like sort of a subtle thing, but it's a very big deal as we venture into these things. The hardcore players sort of demand that sort of thing. So, and then, well, we could just cover that one. Character progression. So that's the next part of this, right? Which is there has to be a character progression in the game of your character's abilities. Again, I know this is sort of obvious, but it's worth stating in this sort of thing. But this differs from other games where the player gets better by their actions. They get better at using the controller at what they do, whereas in a role-playing game, your character gets better by the time you put in and the things that you get. I remember years ago there was a game that as you went up in difficulty, the early level creatures also ramped up in difficulty. And I found that very unsatisfying, right? I'm a level 10 guy, I don't want to have problems with the same level 1 creatures I had at the beginning of the game. So for me, that was very unsatisfying. So I think the idea your character is progressing and getting stronger, and things that were a problem before are no longer a problem, is very powerful. It gives you a great sense of feeling good. The other is cause and effect. One of the most important things, which relates to immersion. And cause and effect has to happen at both a micro level and at a macro level. And so at a macro level, one of the things we did in our recent Bard's Tale is in the very start of the game, maybe 20 minutes in, there's a dog. And you have the opportunity to be nice to that dog or mean to that dog. And if you're nice to the dog, he joins you, and there are whole scenes in the game that happen 10 hours later, 20 hours later, related to the dog, upgrading the dog, dog gets killed at one point. I mean, there's a whole portions of the game. But if you'd been mean to it, the dog would have been gone, and you never would have seen any of that content ever before. And those are the kind of sort of macro cause and effect that I'm talking about. And the deeper you can get those, the better. And then on a shorter micro cause and effect, there's just weapons, right? Which is, if I'm going to get a better weapon, I need to feel the effect of it. It's no good to give me a +5 sword, but I, as the player, don't really feel the difference in how it's affecting things. And that gets back to micro cause and effect. So you always have to be thinking, again, it's obvious to give better weapons, but can the player feel that? And it could be a feedback loop just by giving them numbers for the damage they're generating, but that micro and macro cause and effect is important. It also creates a perception of a much bigger world. The more you do, it's where the replayability comes from. You know, the idea is you want to teach the player to care about the world, and then let them have a chance to affect it. The other thing is that you're going to spend the most amount of time in the game in the conflict system. So the conflict system is traditionally combat, but it could be stealth. You know, and some other games have done some other different kinds of things. It could be dialogue if somebody really wanted to take that attack. But you know you have to know that this is where they're going to spend 90% of their time, and they have to be using their brain during these parts of it. If it's just as simple, if you're just clicking, and sleeping while you're doing it, you're going to lose the player throughout the process. So when you entertain their brain, you have to be mixing it up with, so the player's analyzing situations, they're switching weapons, they're trying new tactics all the time. Always mix it up so they're using their brain, and that's when you've got you engaged. The minute you stop doing that, the game becomes boring, and that's the last thing we want. You know, even better, you know, we try to create systems such that the player thinks that they've found some clever way of cheating the system, right? They really feel like they defeated us designers, and we didn't know they figured this out. Well, chances are we probably did. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And so, but we like to create that, because then you feel like you've carved out your own way of doing something, and you feel like you're cheating us somehow. So we like that. We think we've done a good job when people think they're cheating us. The other thing is, you know, strong world sets. And this differentiates, right? Because you could take Tiger Woods Golf and say, hey, it's almost a role-playing game. You've got character identification, you've got stats and skills, you've got character progression, probably not deep cause and effect, and you've certainly got you have a conflict system, which is swinging a golf club, right? So you're darn close to being what a role-playing game is. But you know, what it doesn't have is world sense, and world sense is very much what separates a role-playing game from a Tiger Woods, which goes in with cause and effect. You know, Fallout, I think we did a great job with Fallout. It had a great art style. The voice acting was excellent. The mood that was set, everything about Fallout resonated like a real world. And again, it was deep, and so you immersed yourself in there, and hours would disappear at a time. You know, or you look at titles like Skyrim or Oblivion. Those worlds are massively huge, and that's how they get to create world sense. There's just so much there, and so much to do, and so much to explore. You have a very strong world sense. And again, I think that takes us towards making a proper role-playing game. And just to hit on a few, and I had a nice little video to show off some of these titles, which we don't seem to have working, so I'll just sort of talk my way through some of this. But you know, these are some of the titles, and Bard's Tale being my first success. And you know, one of the things, and I'm going to get to it later when I talk about something called a vision document, is why these titles existed, because some of these games came to be successful not for the reasons you might have thought they were. They were great games. They had to be great games, but at the same time they were launched for different reasons. You know, Bard's Tale, for example, at the time wizardry was the de facto standard in role-playing games, and it was black and white, and there was no music and no sound effects. So for us, again, we were D&D players, and I spent a lot of my career trying to recreate the D&D experience, was to do, let's do a role-playing game with music, sound, and color graphics. Hey, pretty innovative, right? Well, that's really what made people pay attention to Bard's Tale to begin with. Wasteland is another big title of ours from the past, and that was really kind of the first sandbox role-playing game. You could really go anywhere, do anything, and have that deep cause and effect. It also dealt with moral dilemmas. It was one of the first things where the obvious thing to do was not black and white. You know, I remember we had a scene early on where your party gets attacked by a rabid dog, and so, you know, of course the party shoots and kills the dog, and later on this kid comes up and says, "Have you seen my dog?" And of course, you as the player, no, you killed the poor kid's dog, right? And so you move on, and then later on, the other kids all discover you killed their dog, and so they all start shooting at you. Now, you're in a firefight with a bunch of kids, but you don't want to shoot the kids. On the other hand, you're taking damage. And then when you run away, they're all laughing at you, so they're sort of making you feel stupid. So, you know, that was a very sort of complex set of events that was tugging on people's emotions. It wasn't just black and white, and that was sort of that was the big innovative thing that Wasteland offered at the time. Dragon Wars was something where we focused on making the bad guy do bad things, and I'm gonna touch on that a little bit later. And then Stonekeep was that was a game that, boy, that took 5 years to make, and I think that's one where I can say that it shows what happens when you work on a game too long. You know, we had technology really pass us up during the development cycle. When we first started Stonekeep, it was supposed to be a full screen experience going through a dungeon, and during the time we were in development, Ultima Underworld came out, and at that point they could take the camera, look up, down, left, right, and sideways, and we were on locked rails as we moved through the dungeon, and that became the standard. People wanted to be able to look up, down, left, and right. So it was a fine product, but it wasn't a huge success because it was just too long in the development cycle. And then Fallout, of course, we talked about that, and that was a spiritual successor to Wasteland. Wasteland, we wanted to redo Wasteland, and we didn't have the rights, so we said, you know what, let's do another post-apocalyptic. And there's a lot of references to Wasteland in Fallout, and again, sort of my love of the post-apocalyptic world. Do we have video? Oh, fantastic.
好，大家稍微等一会儿。Right, you have lots of time.
I'm okay. I don't want to run out of time. Okay, good.
我们等一下可以把演讲时间稍微往后再延一段时间，因为下一个演讲已经被取消了。所以大家可以攒足的问题啊，等一下。
of the audio channels wasn't working, all the talking, which I could use later. Okay, let me get back to where I was. So that's what I was going to show in the beginning, so you had some sense of my product history and where I'd come from. Get back to where. Okay, so I think we left off here. The last thing I was going to say on this slide was that Baldur's Gate is certainly another title we're well known for. And, you know, this was, we did Baldur's Gate when Dungeons & Dragons was not cool anymore. I remember one of my big competitors who was having a lot of success with a sort of a mass market title. He said, "Brian, you just don't get it, do you?" And he goes, "Dungeons & Dragons," he said, "it's nicheware for nerds." That's what he called it. And so I said, yeah. And Baldur's Gate, of course, went on to become a huge success for us. And you know, and the other thing that people don't remember about Baldur's Gate is that it was originally supposed to make Christmas of that year. I think it was '98, and we had it miss Christmas just to get the product right. And that's going to be relevant to some other points I make later. But you know, a lot of people talk about working on titles and polishing them, getting them correctly, but when it comes right down to it, and the guns go to your head, you know, it's a harder decision to make sometimes, and it was the right one. We missed Christmas, but it went on to sell 1.5 million copies. So the first thing is, again, so I'm the first. There are many methods for making games. So this is how I approach it. I don't profess to be one right, wrong, or indifferent, but this is what's worked for me. For me, the sensibilities of the game are the most important, and I find that sometimes people get too caught up in the weeds of what the game's going to be before they've really nailed what the sensibilities are. I know I've gone on pitch meetings before, where before I can even get into what the product is, they want to know how many monsters there are, how many levels there are, how many items there are, whatever. And that is secondary to what the experience is, and you need to really nail down what is the sensibilities. And we create something called a vision document. And I'll give you an example of, these are different things that could be on a vision document, right? Which is, what does he want to, if you're going to say we're going to be the largest open world game, if you think that's one of your selling points, you need to understand all of your competition, how big they are, everything that's been done before, and how you're going to technically design and implement the largest open world game and fill it full of content. And that becomes a whole page in itself, right? Or it could be like in Bard's Tale. First color graphics in a role-playing game. Pretty obvious one to sell, but it filled a market condition. Or a top-down version of, that's how Diablo came about, right? The guys at Blizzard are very smart. You know, they looked at success. Even Warcraft was a derivative of Dune, which was one of the first real-time strategy games, and they said, let's do a medieval version of Dune, or let's do a top-down, updated version of Rogue, right? It's take existing things and explain. Or the other thing is people can say, well, an RPG with a great sense of humor. And I list that because sometimes people put in vision documents that it's going to have, you know, be graphically unique, or it's going to have a great sense of humor. I look for examples. Because people they'll write it down on a piece of paper, but then I'll say, okay, give me an example of what you find funny. And if what they're saying is not funny, they're probably not going to be able to hit that point. Or if they say it's going to be graphically unique, and I feel like I've seen the game 100 times before, then maybe they're just not capable. So they need to demonstrate what they can do in that vision document up front. Otherwise, you know, anybody can put down a wish list, but can you execute against it? Or, again, the most customizable RPG ever. So these are all different, and again, these would be from different products, but I really make my guys really focus, and we talk about, before we get into anything, is this vision document. And to me, my role as an executive producer on these games is most powerful on the front end, understanding the vision, making sure there's a role for it, and making them demonstrate that they can do what they're saying they can do. And then it's at the back end also, to make sure to bring that vision document back up and really make sure they've executed across that. unless we made some conscious decision to move off one of the points as a group. That's a different conversation. You can have the perfect execution of a bad concept, and it's not going to help. You know, so it's got to be the high concept up front. And so the vision document should have 5 to 6 things that define that. And a lot of this stuff, it seems obvious, right? But very obvious things will get lost along the way. Even with the most seasoned veterans I've seen, they'll have something and slowly over time the product will twist and turn and become something different, and they'll have forgot the original reason why they started that product and what it was supposed to represent. Again, sounds like a very obvious thing, but I've seen this happen many, many times. You know, and one other point, it's kind of funny because I am very focused on the vision document. I had a developer one time come to me and says he wanted to pitch a product, and he started telling me about the storyline, all the backstory of the characters and how they got in the world they got in. And I said, look, I don't want to hear anything about the storyline. The plot is, tell me the vision, take me through it. They couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. So they're in my place pitching me a product, but they could not tell me why that game should exist. All they could talk about was the plot line and the story. That is not what I want to hear in the beginning. I don't think that's what's important up front. Not to say plot isn't important, but not to this. The other thing is that I believe to have a strong single vision backed up with a collaborative creativity, which is, that's really my way of saying that I like the idea of a movie, of what's going on. Yes, take your input from other people. The strongest product will come from everybody understanding the vision and then it becoming bigger than one person could ever do. But don't let the product get defined by sales, marketing, group consensus, that sort of thing. To me, when you're trying to have a lot of masters all try to create a product together, you're asking for problems. You know, I remember there was a documentary recently on Star Wars, which I love to reference Star Wars for things. And you think about, again, for the first 3 movies, they were smaller productions, and the second 3 were, you know, unlimited money, unlimited CG effects, right? And for me, I liked the first 3 because I felt like he had a strong vision. They weren't trying to make the toy companies happy or the plush toy companies happy. That he had a stronger, singular vision. And when you read about the original Star Wars, they had nothing but problems on the set. Things were breaking down all the time. The costumes didn't fit. It was warm. All you heard about was the thousands of problems that were there, which you know they didn't have on the other ones. Yet he created a masterpiece under those conditions because he had a very strong vision, I believe, for what it was he wanted to do. And I would say that sort of handcrafted feel of a game, I think those games have the most soul. And again, and I get back to the director of staying, so you want to take other people into account and what they're saying, but I always know that every artist I have and every programmer I have, they all think they're game designers, right? And so everybody's weighing in all the time, that's great, but somebody's got to be issuing editorial control to keep things on track. And this one has to do with cause and effect. And again, we put cause and effect variables for the game. I try to create games for different personality types. You find that people play role-playing games, generally speaking, 3 different ways. Mr. Kill or Mrs. Kill, they want to shoot everything, they want to blow everything up, and they want to be rewarded for doing so and finish the game. And then you have Mr. Sneaky that wants to run around and they want to steal everything they can and sneak around, and that's how they want to finish the game. And then there's the diplomat. They want to talk their way through the game. And so if you can satisfy a game that I can play any one of those 2 archetypes of people and have a very satisfying experience, I think you've done a good job. And that's how we've always tried to set it up, to have a sort of multiple way of playing on it. The other one is to treat the audience with intelligence. You know, our players are smart. I think especially in the role, understand nuances and they will understand subtle references. You know, when I was making all those original games, you know, I wasn't thinking of kids in mind. You know, but yet we wrote intelligent stuff and we made puzzles that were tricky and they figured it out. And as you know, as I said earlier, as I traveled somewhat through Asia, and people said, I grew up with your game as a kid, I guarantee they just did. You know, our audience is very smart, and they will figure it out. And I find a lot of games tend to talk down to who their player is, and we've never talked down. We've always treated them as equals. You know, we have a, you know, again, I'll reference this Choplifter game we're doing a couple times, only because it's a game, it's not a role-playing game, but we're about to ship it, so a lot of points of reference are in mind. But there's an old scream they use in every Hollywood movie, or not every, many Hollywood movies, called the Wilhelm scream. It was from like the 1920s or 30s, and so we incorporated that scream as a sort of a funny little thing. We put it in Choplifter. People watch the trailer and they're like, "Did you see the Wilhelm scream?" 28 seconds in, like they knew right away. I mean, I can't say as I would have recognized the Wilhelm scream, right? But you know, we put our audience will pick up on them, and they pick up on them very quickly. You know, the other thing is to assume. We assume that our players will be as good at our games as we are in about 2 hours, right? So when you're thinking about difficulty and how it needs to be, you know, we've had people play our games and get through them faster than we can. We don't even know how they do it, right? But they do. So I think that I think you're going to be better off aiming smarter than aiming dumber. And the thing is, people love good puzzles. You know, in the old days, if we gave you a puzzle, we would actually stop you dead in your tracks. You couldn't even move forward in the game anymore unless you called our hint line or bought a clue book, right? But now, you know, we still give you puzzles, but we don't stop you dead in your tracks. But people do like solving them. Pre-production allows for the greatest creative freedom. So this is step number 2 after the vision document, which is once you're writing and designing a product, you know, the best creativity tends to come in waves, right? Anybody can create something very generic in about 5 seconds. I could go design a game that has 2 trolls standing outside of a cave with a dragon inside sitting on a chest of gold. We've seen that a million times, right? That's not very creative. True creativity tends to come in waves. You can't do it in a crunch. And that's where up front, before you're incurring overhead, is when you need to come up with your biggest ideas from a storytelling perspective. Because once the team is launched and they're spending $100,000 or $500,000 or $1 million a month, that's the last place you're going to have a chance to come up with some great, interesting, clever, and creative ideas. There's too much time pressure. And I think one of the problems I see in the industry is that big teams, they tend to work on a project, they finish, they're exhausted, they work day and night, and then they immediately start the next one, and there's 50 or 100 people that they got to keep busy and working on jobs, but yet nobody really spec'd out the full design of what that next product would be. It's almost like going to a film set without a script and trying to film on location while you're writing the script at the same time. And this happens a lot in our business because they're not given the time to do the pre-production on the next one. On Bard's Tale, we designed every piece of dialogue, every item, every single thing in that game was completely spec'd out. And then we'd sit around and play it around a table first before the programmers and artists did their thing. It also had a secondary effect, which is everybody on the team knew what they were making. You know, again, when you get some of these bigger projects, people are coming in each day and taking something off the wall of their task, and they don't even know what they're creating. And it's more motivating when you know what you're making, and also people have a chance to contribute more if they understand the totality of the product that they're putting together. And the last part on this is there's nothing that replaces gameplay reiteration. There's no amount of genius planning you can do to get around that. You know, we have a saying in America, I don't know, the elephant in the room, which is basically there's a big elephant in the room and, you know, nobody wants to talk about it, you know, and they pretend it's not there. I think that gameplay iteration is something that is, with our businesses, we all know this, okay? But rarely are we all given the chance to do what we know is necessary. You know, Blizzard's one of the top developers in the world, okay? They're known for starting their projects over. They're known for their long end cycles. You know, you hear id get to say, it's done when it's done, right? You know, not very few people get that luxury, yet it is the #1 most important thing to make sure you have a good game. Especially for role-playing games. You know, role-playing games are so intense and so big, you're not even really making the game until you're towards the very end of the project. You don't really know what all the pieces are. And so, you know, even a game, Plants vs. Zombie, pretty simple game. I read they spent 1 to 2 years in playtest on that product, on a very simple game like that. So, That's pretty extreme, but it shows you what can happen. And without that time on the back end, you're really battling uphill. And you think that and if Blizzard needs it, everybody else is going to need it, and also. So, and you really have three scenarios to make this happen. You have to be a developer that has the clout, which would be like Blizzard or Epic, right? That could say, hey, we're doing it our way, Mr. Publisher, and that's the way it is. That's why the games continue to come, the best game come from out of those places. Not just because they're talented, because they get this back-end reiteration time that they're not given. The second scenario is that you have plenty of money in the bank and you get to do it your way. Valve is a great example of that, right? They do great product, they're a great developer, they have so many businesses going on, they have so much success, that cash is not an issue for them. And then the third one is really having a publisher who's understanding of the concept I'm telling you, and that is rarer than it should be. And there are some, and the best publishers have got this figured out and they're doing it, but not all of them do. And they don't put it out at equal measure. And so, and really this last point should almost be aimed at publishers and not developers, because I say shame on the publishers that make the developers work on these products for year-round, round the clock. They finally got their baby together, and now they need that one last couple cycle to get it right, and they're forced to ship it out the door. And out goes another bad product, and down goes your Metacritic rating, right? And so it's really, to me, the point is almost really aimed at a publisher than a developer. So again, to me, number one most important thing. And again, I'll say that on, we just had this again with the Choplifter game. We put it into QA, into a focus group. We did some iteration gameplay. The game is twice as good as it would have been, having spent just an extra 60 days on that product. So, storytelling. How am I doing on time? Am I okay on time? Okay, all right. Nobody's walking out yet, so I'm okay. So everything starts with character. All great story starts with character. I find a lot of people, they'll start writing their plot, writing their story, yet there's no character definition, right? I like to think of the show, and this is what, this is the one thing we have in common with linear medium is the idea of character creation. There's a show called Lost, which I think I'm told that people in China are familiar with. And if you think about that show, not a very interesting premise. You're lost, right? But yet it's a fascinating show, and it's done great because you have all these great, deep archetypes of characters. You have the hero, you have the con man, you have the kind of the guy who's the ex-rock star with the drug problem, right? There's a bunch of interesting characters, and once you start to buy up on those characters, you can put them in any kind of situation, right? And so it can't just be that the too many games just start with, bad guy wants to, destroy the world, which makes no sense whatsoever. There's a reluctant hero, and it kind of stops right there. It's okay to have a reluctant hero, but maybe he can be, maybe he can have a jealous streak in him. Maybe he can be overly cautious, right? Maybe there can be some other human attributes that you can apply to these characters, because once you define the characters and you have a real strong sense of who they are, the writing comes very easily, right? Whether it's Lost or whether it's the characters from Star Wars, once you understand how they think and how they would behave and the dynamics between each other, then it's easy. The storytelling, it flows very, very easily. And this even applies to cartoons. Kung Fu Panda 2, love that movie. I love those characters. Toy Story 3, people cried at the end of Toy Story 3. To get a cartoon to make people cry means you did a really good job on character creation. So if a cartoon can make you cry, then you know that it really comes down to that storytelling. And so the other thing is that it's okay if when the game starts, your characters have a history that the player doesn't know about, right? So a lot of the games, they tend to focus on a backstory of something that happened 1,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, what the bad guy did, but there's no focus on what the main character, there's no reference points. We have on our games where we will have the characters constantly talking about something that happened previously to them in the world, even though you as the player don't know anything about it. You've never heard anything about it. And we may or may not reference it again in the future, but what it does is it builds a richer, deeper character. Next one is make the bad guys do something evil, right? So So I imagine, I'll give you an analogy of how again, Star Wars, one of my favorite movies, and if it was a computer game, right? So imagine if Star Wars started where, it opens up, Darth Vader comes out, you see him for a brief moment, Princess Leia, puts the plans on R2-D2, sends him down on the planet, right? At that point, which he finds the droids, he gets captured on the Death Star, he escapes, he destroys the Death Star, he meets Yoda, learns his power, his friends get captured, he rescues his friends. But keep in mind, we've never seen Darth Vader again in this version of it, okay? Luke runs off, he fights a battle with a bunch of teddy bears, right, who help him. Then he goes back to the Death Star, and again, we haven't seen Darth Vader one single time in this version of it, right? And here comes the big guy in the beginning who's dressed in black, who you don't know at all. He says, "I'm your father, Luke," and he kills him, right? That's it, right? You'd think, what the hell happened, right? And in fact, you would think that Luke was the villain at that point, right? And so role-playing games do that a lot. You have to have the bad guy do something to the character throughout so that you don't like him, And one of the things you have is time loss is the thing that people are most worried about. You spend X amount of hours doing something, let the bad guy take that item away. Let that bad guy kill one of the NPCs. Let him kill your dog, right? Let him do something to make it personal. He can knock you back 3 levels, right? Do something so that when you get to the end and you finally get a chance to kill the bad guy, it doesn't become like the first time you saw Darth Vader again, right? I think that's an important part, where making the bad guys do something bad. The other part is, I find the journey is the reward, more than the plot. To me, the initial plot is secondary to the moments that happen along the way. Again, I'll use another movie reference. I don't know how popular it is. Pulp Fiction. It was a big movie in the States, but basically, it was a very popular movie. It won a lot of awards, but they were looking for a suitcase, and you didn't even know what was inside of it. And you never even really found out. It didn't even matter. What happened was, along the way was all these fascinating things that happened to the character, and that's really what mattered. That's where the journey matters. But sometimes with something we put in Wasteland, in Bard's Tale, we'll put an area that the players cannot get to early on, and they can try, but they're going to get killed, and they're going to try again when they get a little stronger, they get killed again and again. When they finally beat that area and get into it, because we allowed you to go there anytime you want, it's a great feeling of a moment. You finally beat the guys that have been killing you the whole time, right? And that, to me, is a little moment, and it's a little journey along the way that's more important than the overall plot line. I'm sure everyone probably has their sort of, favorite moments from games that they have that were more likely to happen to be contained in the game, as opposed to, I was at the very end, it was the ending that had me the most exciting of all the moments in it. Next part is that storytelling needs to have logic, right? Which is, we exist in fantasy, we exist in science fiction, we do all sorts of crazy things when it comes to logic. We have sound in space, we have teleporting, we may have ghosts that can't move through walls, we have Jedi Knights, we have dragons, we have people who are immortal. We do all these crazy things, right? But there's a logical world that gets behind it. But it's the logic of the story, the little moments, that has to work. The worst thing we can have is somebody saying, did they even play their own game? Or did they even see their own movie? Right? And so the more you pound on them of the illogic of people not behaving correctly, you'll lose them, because the suspension of disbelief. And I have this, I'm not meaning to pick on the movie Waterworld, but again, I don't know if you guys have heard of it, and I'll explain it, but basically the entire world has been covered in water, and they are looking to, and there's no dry land. Well, one little girl has a tattoo on her back that has supposedly the map to dry land. Well, the whole movie, the bad guys are stealing her to get to the dry land, the good guys are trying to get her back, you're chasing the girl around the whole time. Why don't they just write it down, right? Just write it down on a piece of paper and we're done, right? So that's the kind of logic I mean. You can do all the crazy stuff, but be logical when it comes down to it. There was another movie recently, I don't remember the name, with Denzel Washington. They were trying to find the last Bible on earth, right? The most printed book in the world, and they can't find it, right? So, they had Shakespeare, the Quran, they can't find that one, right? So to me, there has to be a logic to it beyond. You can do all the crazy stuff, but it's also related to treating the players intelligently. And the other one is using anticipation. This is, again, this isn't like a groundbreaking concept, but it's something that we use that I don't see a lot of it used. One of my favorite books is called Tengu by Graham Masterton. And I'll tell you how this book, well, this is the first sentence of the book. It says, when Sherry Cantor's alarm clock woke her at 7:27 on the morning of August 9th, she had 23 minutes to live. Boom. One sentence, I am hooked into that book. And each paragraph was the clock down of when that thing going lower and lower and lower until some event was going to result in the death of Sherry. And so, to me, those little anticipation techniques work wonderful, and they're not utilized very often. You know, I think about, I'll give you a sort of an example. So, like, here's a guy walking down the street. You know, you don't have any real emotional reaction to a guy walking down the street. But if I show you this scene first, right, where here's a building and a safe flying out of a window, okay, so now you know that thing's hurtling towards the earth, and then you see the guy walking, it changes the context for which you're viewing the guy. Very simple techniques of anticipation and building and foreshadowing that, again, role-playing games and storytelling don't do a lot of. And the last one is to let the system create the best moments. And so what I mean by that is, and this gets back to I think time loss, again, is the greatest variable you can use on a player, that risk of losing time, is that, you know, if I say, you know, here, you know, here's a sword, and you work 2 hours to get a sword, and you're told there's a troll in a dungeon that wants that sword, and you go there and he steals your sword, you're mad, right? And that was a working, that wasn't a, I really wasn't telling a story there. I was using a variable of time. Or in Wasteland, one of the things that used to drive people crazy is that ammunition was always hard to come by. And you had your main characters in your group, and then you could add non-player characters. Well, the non-player characters had a mind of their own within a certain set of variables. And so there was one particular NPC, she was great with a machine gun, so you always wanted to give her the machine gun, you always wanted to give her the ammunition so she could do it, but she was trigger happy. And so you would go into a combat with a single rat, and she would empty the entire Uzi into a rat, right? And of course you're screaming because it was so hard to get ammunition, right? And that was a moment of the game, that was a storytelling moment, that's a moment you're probably likely to tell your friend how frustrated you were that this woman shot her machine gun into a single rat, but that wasn't a scripted moment that was written by designers, right? And so that's how I differentiate the system, creating the best moments. I say the other example I'll give on a moment, again, you think about Angry Birds, when you hit that last piece and the physics is just barely, it just falls over, right? That feeling good moment there, right? You know, I did have some other examples. You know, if I'm in a multiplayer game, and my friends are playing with me, and we all rush into a room, and there's this super powerful item in the middle of the room, and I rush and get it there before they all do, that feels good, right? That's a moment, right? Or we're exploring some deep, dark chasm, I come up to the edge, and I push my friend over the edge, and I hear him scream all the way down. That's a fun moment, right? So, so you want to build for those. Even I had a little Mario DS game I played years ago, and I could pick up my buddy and hold him over my head, and he couldn't do anything while I was on top, and I would run around on the top of my head, and I'd throw him into a cliff, right? Great little moments, and we think about those as storytelling moments that aren't necessarily, you know, straight up storytelling. So personality I put down is personality, which is moments and charm are all part of the same thing. This is a difficult one to describe. One person's version of charm is another person's yawn, perhaps, and I hope we get the video to work at the end with the dialogue. I guess there's two versions of this for me, is, you know, where basically you want the player commenting, I can't believe they thought of that, right? And so or it's an expected moment. You basically have an unexpected moment, which could be Darth Vader, I'm your father, totally unexpected, or you can have an expected moment that hasn't been seen before, which is, you know the Death Star is going to blow up the planet, but when it finally does it, it's so, it's so over the top that it's sort of a moment. So I put in the first category self-awareness. This is where we like to try to have our games have an awareness of what the player is doing at any given time and how they're going to act in certain situations, so we can play off of that self-awareness. I'll give you another example in Bard's Tale that we did, which was we put chickens all around the game. And by the way, we put chickens in all our games. We allow you to kill chickens in all our games. That's our little secret. I don't know why, but we think it's funny. So the chickens are actually kind of difficult to kill, and so you're chasing one, and you're doing it, and we know people are going to do it just because it's funny, right? Well, after they kill 50 chickens, a huge chicken comes out and just beats down on the player, right? And so we knew you'd do it, and we reacted to knowing what you were doing, and then you're like, I can't believe they're doing that to me after I killed all those chickens, right? To me, that's sort of a self-awareness moment. Humor, again, again, associated with self-awareness, I find the best humor comes in unexpected places. It's a tricky proposition using humor. You have to be careful with it, right? Which is, and we've done a comedy game. If you do too much humor, you become a comedy, right? And that, downside to that is that RPGers take their worlds very seriously, right? So you don't want to make too light of it unless you're purposely making it a comedy. There was a great moment in Lord of the Rings where he says no one tosses a dwarf, right? And everybody knew that was a cultural reference point. It was funny, but they didn't beat you over the head with it over and over like that, right? And if you do a comedy, it gives the reviewers one more thing to critique you against, right? So, because you're already being held up for graphics, for writing, for sound, for music. Then it has to be, is it funny, right? You could do everything and they don't think it's funny and they have a chance to criticize. You have to be careful with humor, but certainly humor is something that I put under the personality and charm category. And this is psychological manipulation, which is basically trying to lead the character down one path of thinking and then take them into another, right? And they did all these things to make you think that way. So we try to always sort of get the player to think one thing and then take them somewhere else. And then shock is, again, another unexpected moment where, like I referenced earlier in that book, Carry and Comfort, where I'm following this protagonist character who's a great dad, he's a great husband, he's a super guy, you think he's going to kill the bad guys, and 200-300 pages, they kill him. I had to keep going back a couple pages to make sure I read it right. It was so outrageous to me. So, using that kind of shock, and again, in Bard's Tale, we killed your dog off, which, that really gets to people. You can kill off NPCs all day. When you kill the dog, people get really upset. Now, I hope this video works about what's ahead with the bad guys, and it doesn't work out too well for him. One rat, piece of crowd. Supposed to say quest complete. We're missing the audio of the speaking here. He's speaking here. He's saying how he's quest complete, how proud he is, and then the real rat comes out. Then the narrator is making fun of the bard during this process. So they're all laughing at his expense, having sent him down there, having known what they had really done to him. So she says, "Nicely done." And then he says, "No, more like well done." The other guy says, "No, more like medium rare." So this is the bard first encounters zombies and they're breakdancing. And then he says at the end, "You've been served." So they're all laughing at him, laughing, and then it's not so funny now. Okay, we'll get through this here. Game balance. Talk about game balance. So the first thing, my simple rule is if you're not dying, you're not having fun. And so there is no tension in a game that you're not having fun. I think one of my biggest issues with a lot of the Facebook games is you can't die. You can take your level 1 guy, go against a dragon, you probably won't die. And so I think that you'll lose all the tension. And games used to be a lot harder than they used to be. Again, I talk about the time function. You know, the original Bard's Tale, and we can't do this anymore, is that you could only save the game when you were out of the dungeon. And so when you were down and you were exploring, you knew that the only way to level up and to increase was to get out of there. But you would, you'd be low, you'd maybe kick open one more door, and you'd kick it open, and something would attack, and you would run to the surface, and if you got out of there with 1 hit point, you would stand on your desk and cheer. And that was the tension from dying and from losing 2 hours worth of information. These days, people want to save game every 3 seconds, so you lose some of that. So there has to be ways, but you have to. You need the dying to create the tension. And the thing is, what you need to do is make sure that you get the players to blame themselves should they die. And so it could be they knew they should have left, but they were greedy and they kicked in 1 more door. You're bad, right? Or you knew that nighttime was coming and you need to get inside and you didn't make it in time. Your mistake, right? We're always focused on making sure. And what happens in games is people have to repeat an area. They try to rush through quickly, right? Because they don't want to do it again. Well, we leave the things in the same places. So if you go rushing through and you die because you were rushing, your fault. You blame yourself because you were rushing. And it's another reason why you have to be very careful with AI, right? Because if things are happening in a seemingly random way and you have the difficulty dialed up, you could be going through and you could get a different reaction. Then you start blaming the computer rather than yourself. And so I think that there's a delicate balance there between those two things. Puzzle theory, just a couple simple ones on that, is that you need to try to make sure you don't draw on anything outside the universe, right? If your players are Googling the answer, then you probably haven't done a very good job of puzzle design, and it's not fair either, right? You shouldn't ask them about the circumference of the Earth, or how many ounces of gold are in an ingot, or anything that is necessary that you would have to Google or go outside of the universe. All the answers have to be contained within the universe if you want to keep it together. And I'll say, again, in the past, we would have puzzles where if you didn't solve the puzzle, you were stuck, you couldn't move forward. I think that's modified over time, which is we'll give you puzzles of varying difficulty. You just get a bigger reward for figuring it out. So we will give you puzzles that you won't figure out, but if you do, you get a bonus for doing so. We're okay with that. We won't stop you dead in your tracks like we used to. This is observe others playing the game, and this means observe people who are not on the team playing the game. This can be very painful to do, and we put people in front of a game, and it comes up, and you're watching them play through a window, and it says press any key to continue, and they can't find the any key on the keyboard, and you just want to grab them, right? And so you have to force yourself to go through that exercise to watch people play the game. And now, we don't want to make games for people that can't find the any key. That's not really the point, but you will, through that process, watch people and observe and see how they play your product, and it will get you to admit some things to yourself about the product that is probably in the back of your mind that you've been thinking about. Again, in our experience with Choplifter, which we did recently, it's just night and day what we were able to do with that product because of this last step. So the production side, one thing that makes RPGs very unique is the amount of non-essential assets that you have to create. If you make a film, 100% of your assets are seen by 100% of the people. On an RPG, only a percentage is, right? And that makes project managers and accountants very unhappy. You have to explain to them that you have to make all this stuff that some people are not going to see at all. But it's a necessary part of the cause and effect formula for a role-playing game. And if you think about some of the biggest successes we've had in our industry, is SimCity or Minecraft, right? Those are all about cause and effect. There's no asset creation. It's cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. People want cause and effect. You have to create assets that not everyone's going to see if you want good cause and effect in a role-playing game. Otherwise, it's just a linear experience. The way we plan, when we create our content, we plan on about 70% of our people, of our content seen by pretty much everyone. We have about 20% of our content, which just a minority will see, and probably 10% that an extreme minority will see. And that's how we put these together, so you get a sense, you get a high replayability factor from that. You know, we're doing the Bard's Play Game, my reference, I've been playing it on the airplane on the way over here because we have an iPad version coming out, and I have forgotten how much stuff we put into the game that I play, that my other guys put in, and it's like, I'm actually having a good time playing one of my own games, or role-playing games, because of all that extra content that I had forgotten about or my guys had put in. Trade-offs will be made. Just sort of keep that in mind that every product that's ever shipped, somebody had to make a trade-off along the way. You ran out of disk space, you ran out of RAM, you ran out of money, you ran out of time. Something's going to go. There's going to be trade-offs to be made. You got to get over it. Don't let the purists make the product go forever. But this is where an understanding of really knowing who your audience is. You got to make the right trade-offs that reflect that original sensibility document, because they're going to come down. And don't forget, you know, a lot of times people deal, we were going to have 10 levels, right? And now it's 8. Well, the users never knew you were going to have 10 levels, so it's okay. You went to 8. It's better to have an entertaining, tight, short experience than something that's long and drawn out and boring. So cutting the right kinds of things is okay, because you're going to something's going to have to be to give at the end. So this is sort of a funny saying, which is don't ship the games with the games you can with the things you can ship without, right? And this sort of seems to conflict with the trade-off discussion, but this comes down to really like the personality, which is, and I think this probably differentiates me from a lot of the way I handle production versus others, is that all the little bits that made the game funny, entertaining, interesting, made the AI smooth, made the user interface smooth. These are little things. You can ship a game with functionality, right? You can, with pure functionality. And so you get towards the end, and all these little things that you wanted to do that would have made the game clever or interesting, they start to fall by the wayside every single time, you know. Or, you know, I'll be in meetings and I'll say, oh, you know, wouldn't it be great if we did such and such? And everybody would go, yeah, they'd nod their head or they'd laugh, and then nobody write it down. Nobody in the room writes it down, right? Those are the best ideas. The ones that when everybody's nodding their head or laughing, get those ideas in. Get them on a piece of paper. I treat those ideas as important as a major feature. And it could be, you know, with Choplifter, I said, I want the zombies to be able to grab on the helicopter, and you have to shake them off as you're flying around. And sure enough, it's a fun moment. People like it. You hadn't seen it before. It was a day's worth of work, right? But it gave it a little bit of charm that it wouldn't have had otherwise. It just wasn't just another helicopter game. And so those little things, but you have to really be, because they don't have to be in the game. So you're arguing strongly with your team to put things in the game that are not necessary to be there. It's one of the hardest things to deal with in production, is to do that. And I always say, it doesn't have to be my idea. Beat my idea. If I come up with some crazy idea, I don't care whose it is. If you want to come up with a different one, that's fine. It doesn't have to come from me. But make sure you stay focused on those little things. That's the difference. That's where the charm comes in. And then, this is the last bit here. I guess this is the last one. So now you've gone through all the elements of how to make a great game. You know, all the things at least I focus on to make a good role-playing game. Now you need to focus on what element will ruin the experience. Because, you know, you can ask developers, they'll tell you why the game is great. Maybe they hit all the things in the vision document that I talked to you about. They'll go on and on and on and on, but it's running at 9 frames a second. All that good stuff is out the door. You have to make an honest assessment of asking your team, what is the thing that will ruin the experience? And it's sort of a horrible thing to imagine. Everybody knows in the back of their head, I find. They know what the problems are, but they don't want to admit it to themselves, right? And sometimes the focus groups are good, because we'll all have them in the back of our head, and then the focus group will say everything we knew. We knew 80% of what the problems were, but they pointed it out to us one more time, and that's what gave the team the courage to go and do that. And so, even with phones, I've bought phones before that were great, but the way they updated and refreshed the screen, boom, killed the whole experience for me. I returned the phone, even though it did everything else fantastic, right? You have to really think hard about what is the one thing that's going to ruin the entire experience of what you've done. So, anyway, that's the end of my my speech. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. 好，我们进入问答环节。哎 ，Nobody? Yes, no hands. Q&A session. 有人提问吗 ？Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, do you think that, as you said, Dungeons and Dragons is a huge influence in RPGs? Do you think that that's still holding back the RPG industry now? Do we need to break away and come up with a completely new way to RPGs, or is
Well,
that?
Yeah. Do you mean like fantasy or the rule
high
sets?
fantasy and the back end is basically number crunching.
Right. Well, I mean, certainly things have migrated in terms of what WoW represents and the impact of it. I don't know. Whenever we tend to try things that are too far off the path, people tend to come back and they want science fiction and fantasy over and over again. I mean, I remember BioWare one time wanted to do some kind of Western, and I think they did the Jade Empire series, but ultimately they've come back to doing Dragon Age and Mass Effect, right? And so it just seems as much as where, we did Neuromancer, which was a cyberpunk type effect. It just seems that there's this romantic notion of medieval times that we have and of science fiction, and I just don't see us getting away from it. I think 50 years from now we'll be sitting in a room like this and talking about the same kind of things. The next.
Thank you for your speech and thank you for that experience in game production. I have a very short question regarding making the great best moment in the game. So by doing this, it's when the game designers are writing their game script stories, they think about making this special moment for game player, or just after you release the game, some game player they have some feedback about their great best moment, which is by accidentally we have this kind of result. So do you give us more detail, like experience or design idea about this?
So is the question, at what point during the production phase do we start to layer in those moments?
Yes.
Is that the question?
By design or by accident?
Well, honestly, a little bit of both, right? I mean, certainly up front, you can come up, when you're writing the design side of it, when you're trying to do something that's creative that you haven't seen before, the major brush strokes have to be done up front that are interesting and clever, right? So whether, with Bard's Cell, we put a bunch of song and dance numbers in the game. We thought that was funny, right? And in fact, they were the first thing we did in production, because we knew if we got to the end, everybody would want to get rid of the song and dance numbers because they're not necessary to be in the game. So we would actually force ourselves to do some non-critical things up front. But the other part of the moments, you have to feel it. The game, because when the game finally comes together towards the end, that's when you can feel the experience, and then we'll come up with a different layer of ideas and moments, as I say. So really, a little bit on the front end, a little bit on the back end, which is where, when I described earlier, I spend my most amount of time at the front end of the project and the back end of the project.
好，下一个。哎，有工作人员递一下话筒那边。
Hi. So I was really interested in your comment about really defining what element ruins the experience.
But at a GDC Online, I can't remember who, someone commented that if we did everything that focus groups told us to do, and got rid of everything focus groups said they didn't like, Bambi's mom never would have died, and that movie, and then Bambi wouldn't have been as great a movie as it is. So when you're trying to figure out what element will ruin the experience, how do you figure out what it is there are things that players think they don't want, but actually they do. How do you tell the difference between things they actually don't want and things they just think they don't want?
Yeah, well, that somewhat comes back related to the strong singular vision at the beginning and have confidence of the product that you're building. You're right, I don't believe in games being made by focus groups at all, not at all, okay? But if you see the same comment come over at one after another, then at some point you have to address it, right? Yeah, do I care about one or two opinions? No, but if I run 6 different focus groups and every single one of them was frustrated with something, then I think we have to address it. But the other part of the focus groups is you're right. They won't tell you what you can watch people have an experience. You'll see the problem, but if you're in tune with your game, you'll solve the problem in a way that they're not even saying. Okay, you'll see where they're stuck or they're dealing with whatever it is, but you have to solve it. They won't give you the solutions to the problems often, but you can at least see where the problems are. Playing game, I could have told you chapter and verse of every role-playing game ever made and what they did and the pluses and the minuses. Now there are so many in so many different categories that I really can't. So I think the beginning D&Ds. I mean, we're kind of social. I mean, D&D was always social, so I understand the desire to do the MMOs, right, which is to play with your friends. But on the other hand, I also love a good story, right, and that's harder to pull off when it's like an MMO. It isn't the same. You can't, you don't know, this person's here, this person's there, what if they pull the lever before I get there, right? Everything kind of falls apart when you're trying to tell a narrative, right? So all I can say is I think you just have to go for whatever experiences you want to pull off and then execute against it, right? So if you want to do a strong narrative game, then build around it, but don't, you can't be all things to all people sometimes, right? So I just see it as a completely different experience. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah.
Brian, I'd like to follow up on that actually. Does that mean that you personally would rather stay out of the online multiplayer RPG category?
No, it doesn't necessarily mean that. It just means that, if I'm going to go for a narrative experience, it's going to be a different kind of production as I am from an MMO or from a multiplayer side, I mean, I do, one of the things I do see is, most of the early games, Bard's Tale, Wizardry, Wasteland, they were party-based games, right? And so, party-based games are great. Whether I'm enjoying or playing 1 guys or 6 guys, so then you get into that, okay, well, what happens if my friends control the other 5 guys, right? Okay, well, that maybe you can still pull off a linear experience, but do I untether them and let everybody run where they want? Then that creates a different set of issues. So I'm just sort of addressing how you put it together. It's not, if I could make a Wasteland game where my other 4 or 5 guys were controlled by my friends and we could tell a good narrative experience, I think that'd be a great experience. So it's not that I wouldn't be. It's not an open-ended MMO. It's just sort of a different kind of product is all.
好，还有吗？
Extension to the 2 previous questions.
哎，哪位工作人员拿一话筒到这边来？那个门口站的那个。
You need the mic so they can translate.
Yes, an extension of the 2 previous questions. Did you have some thoughts on what a good RPG can be on the SNS world?
On the
what?
Social game. What good RPG can be as a social game?
Well, when you talk about the social games, you're usually talking free to play, right? And so that changes the dynamics completely in terms of, now I'm sort of focused on how to sell you things constantly, right? So it's a different kind of experience, and trying to create that type of product. I think people are starting to make some pretty good attempts at that in terms of, it seems like there's kind of an old school kind of RPGs I'm seeing on some of the iOS and some of the Facebook, so I'll be kind of curious to see how they do it. But again, it's just a different experience when really I'm just trying to sell you stuff constantly, and what does that mean? So it's just not a product that we've done yet. I mean, we love the idea of social, and we're doing some Facebook stuff, but not an RPG.
还有吗？还有问题吗？
Oh.
Okay, I will see you as my intended. Okay, my first question is how do you control the planning until production of a game? And what do you do to maintain the previous game? And second question, what parameter do you think you will release the next version of the game, or you just stop this game until this version? And the third question, okay.
Yeah. I'll try to remember them all, but yeah.
And what about if your skilled developer that currently creating the game is leaving the company? So what do you do about it? And the last question. who will decide which single fiction that will be selected during the planning session when you discuss it?
Okay, well, let's start with the first. Let's start with the first question. What was it?
Yeah. So how do you control the planning and the production of a game? And what do you do to maintain the risk?
Well, so this is the planning production. Once we're in full production, you're saying this is the planning.
From the planning.
From the planning. Well, let's see. Well, on the planning side, we make sure that we give our writer designers enough period of time where they can work on the thoughts, work on the ideas. We can go in the back and forth of things for 6 months before there's any overhead really associated with what they're doing. They need to be able to operate without the pressure of hurrying up. And again, and that's where I see the problems where a lot of big products finish and then the next one starts and there's 100 people on the payroll all looking at the writers going, hurry up, right? And you know, nobody can be creative with that kind of pressure. You know, not in the same way, I should say. You can be creative, but it's very difficult. Once we're in production, you know, it really comes down to communication. We're in constant communication with the team. And the team knows nobody's allowed to add features without discussion, right? You know, I think in the past, you know, when things were smaller teams and things were not as expensive, some guy would come in from last night and go, look what I just added, isn't this great, right? And we're like, well, no, that wasn't great because that might have cost us 2 weeks and our burn rate is $200,000 a month and that just cost us $100,000, right? So we don't think that feature is great. What we like to do though is we make sure if they do have those ideas, let us decide as a group whether it's worth spending that time and what are the full effects of that. So it's really having the team, you have to be in constant communication about the pluses and minuses and not letting individuals decide what they're going to do just because they had a clever idea, because they can affect the whole team. So, you know, we really just have to stay on top and just talk about it all the time. That's all you can really do on the production side. Understand the cause and effect of changes. So what was the second question?
What parameter do you think to say that you will release the next version of the game?
When will I do what?
What parameter that you can decide whether you will stop this
Oh, when we release the game? That's what I decide. That's my job.
And I think for the start there, what about if the current skill developer leaves the company?
Oh, we hunt it down. No. No. Look, you know, if a person leaves a project at the wrong time, it can throw your whole company off, right? I mean, it just has profound effects. We've been very fortunate that we haven't had much of that happen, right? Usually, most programmers, artists, whatever, they're a critical path, their leaving is going to throw the entire project off. Most of them don't do that. They have some sort of ethics on how they're going to affect people. And certainly, if somebody's hiring the guy, right, I mean, you know, it has happened to me one time where I called him, I said, you know, you're hiring a guy that's going to throw our entire project off. Do you really want him on your project? I mean, right? I mean, this person, we need him, right? So, and then they said, okay, they let us keep him for like, it was like 2 more weeks. And that's all that was really necessary, right? So, you know, I think it comes down to how you treat people, ultimately, right? You know, in order to retain people, talent in this business, it's not just money. Money is just one of the variables. It's having people get heard, treating them with respect, and everything goes along with it. You tend not to have issues like he's discussing where, you know, you're a month out and somebody leaves right before you get done. That happens very rarely, at least in our organization. Who what?
Who will decide the single vision?
Decide the what?
The single vision.
The single vision? Ah. Well,
a lot of heads, lots of things,
again, I'm the in my company. I go and speak to my company, right? So, which I'm the executive producer or producer, depending on how far in the details I get. But that's my job, right? To either to be that person or to make sure I have a person who has that single vision, who understands, and there's a lot of discussion. I think one of the hardest things to find, and we want to, you know, I was visiting Singapore, and now obviously I'm in China looking at doing development down here, is there's a lot of engineers, there's a lot of artists, but what we want to do is really help spend the time of how to do that role, which is the production role, because I think it's one of the harder things to do, because you have to draw upon so much, right? You have to be somewhat technical, you have to be somewhat like a psychiatrist, you have to be like a philosopher, you have to be an artist, a storyteller. There's so many things that go into it, but we try to find and train those people. And then, and we have those back at home, and when we have someone, we train them, and then they become that single vision creator.
还有问题吗？大家可以用中文提问啊，有吗 ？OK， 那还有一位。
I know that there are a lot of mobile RPGs. So when designing this kind of RPG, what's the difference between designing a PC version?
What's the difference between a mobile RPG?
Yeah.
Well,
based on the iPhone or ESP.
Well, again, there's so many different categories now that I wouldn't even pretend to know, the Eastern mobile role-playing game market, right? I think that from what I can see, that the mobile RPGs are really closer to the RPGs we had sort of in the late 80s and early 90s, sort of like the original Bard's Tale type product. But again, they're more generally focused on selling you things and not just the experience. It's always sort of, if you're going to give something free to play, you kind of got to beat them on the head a lot, to buy stuff, right? You always got to be making the game kind of difficult unless they buy something, or they can save some time if they buy something, right? So, I mean, to me, that's the biggest factor is this constant need to sell them things with real money, right? But, that said, it can work, but it reminds me more of the early role-playing games than it does some of the later ones.
好，还有吗？
不好意思，我用中文发问一下啊。我记得我以前在玩这个 MMORPG 的时候，我们是很有耐性的，就是说玩一个游戏，我们可以在一个关卡去不断的寻找一些谜团的一些谜点啊。但是我们发现现在的玩家越来越没有耐性了，就是说他对这个故事情节也不是这么在意了。我们事实上做了一些这种类似眼动仪的这种试验哦，我们发现很多玩家是根本眼睛是在寻找确认的按钮，下一步的按钮，然后不断的往下一关卡走。那这也使得我们现在很多游戏的设计变成越来越无脑化，就是很多自动打怪，然后自动寻路、自动解任务，然后最后呢就自动得到奖励。那我不知道这样的一个进展对他来说，他有什么样的看法？有什么他面对这样的一个进展，他有什么建议？
The question is now the users are more and more impatient. They don't find they are not interested in the story. They just found the next button. How do you think about it?
I have to think about that. That was the longest question I ever heard. I'm trying to think if I agree with that or not. I do agree that people are more impatient than ever before, right? I find the more technology I get, the more impatient I get. It's like, text message me please, I don't want to have a conversation, right? So I can understand that part of it, whether they, I think when I think story though, I think more like moments though, right? So maybe you're right, I don't think they want to read and read and read. I agree with that part of it. But do they want a story? Do they want to be put in interesting situations? I think they still do, right? It's not like, otherwise it would just be an RPG simulator, right? You would just sit there and you would be with a spreadsheet and it would keep rolling things and you'd keep upgrading and you'd spend time and you'd be using your sword or your gold to increase, but what would be the point, right? The reason you're putting your time in and spending your money is because there's some kind of action you're doing that's satisfying you, right? That goes beyond just upgrading, right? So you're exploring, you're finding things, you're getting visual payoffs, right? And you're getting moments along the way. So I think those parts of it remain the same, right? It's just the telling the long, wordy stories, screen after screen after screen. Yes, I tend to agree. No patience for that.
好吗？那我们最后一个问题了哈，时间差不多。
I'd like to ask what's the future of RPG? Where to maintain a same style or model like now?
What was the last part you said?
What's the future of the RPG?
Bro, what's it?
RPG game 就是 like the model or the play style. Where to change?
I see. Well, I think similar to the point we were just talking about, that the narrative RPG is becoming less and less, right? That people are more focused on the social RPG, right? Where people can exist. From my take, I see people playing these role-playing games now are becoming more an extension of their own personal lives than they have in the past. You know, I hear people spending $10,000 or $50,000 US dollars to increase their character, to give themselves vanity in these worlds. I see that the role-playing games are becoming real worlds to people, you know, and it becomes where they get their, you know, their excitement in life, right? You know, maybe their normal everyday life is not that exciting, but they go in this world and they're the king, you know, and everybody, you know, carries signs with their pictures on them and tells them how, you know, wonderful and good looking they are, and that appears to be the world. So I think that part of RPGs is going to continue to be the strongest driver where people can put themselves into worlds and interact with other human beings, because no narrative could compete with that, right? Before there were social games, you never heard anybody spending $50,000 on a role-playing game. You know, it never happened, right? But this is happening with these kinds of role-playing games. So for me, the power of that seems undeniable.
Okay, thanks a lot for
okay, thank you.
Give us a